Hello, Mohit. So I'm going to go ahead and present my answer to the interview questions in this task. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. Question one was, what does the CRISPR-DM methodology for data mining entail, and what does the data analyst do in each step? So CRISPR-DM stands for Cross Industry Standard Process for Data Mining, and it's a widely used analytics model that breaks down the data mining process into 6 phases. Um, Phase one is about business understanding. So, this is all about understanding the goals and priorities of the project. Phase two is about data understanding. So, this involves gathering data, performing quality checks, looking for errors, missing values, inconsistencies, things like that. Doing a little bit of preliminary exploration, like calculating mean, median, mode, that sort of thing. Um, and in this step, the understanding that we develop might require us to go back and revisit phase one, business understanding. Um, Otherwise, we go on and we do data preparation. So that would be phase three, and this is where we get our data ready for analysis. So we spend a lot of time selecting and cleaning data in this phase. Once the data is prepared, it's ready for some modeling, and so that's where we develop a prototype model, which is like a combination of logic and algorithms and things to apply to the data. I think an example is useful here. So for example, if we were trying to detect fraud, then we might look at several variables like age, occupation, geography, etc., to try to determine what makes a transaction more likely to be fraudulent. And the combinations of those variables that we think makes a fraudulent transaction would be a prototype model. So that's kind of phase four, is coming up with the prototype model, and then we test that model. So phase five is the evaluation phase, and this is where we assess whether the model meets the business goals that we defined in phase one. So continuing on with the fraud example, presumably one thing that would happen here is that experts would compare actual fraud cases to transactions that were flagged fraudulent by the prototype model. And the analyst, me in this case, would then determine how well the outcomes match, between the actual fraud and the transactions that were deemed to be fraudulent by the model. We would determine how well those match, and then make recommendations about whether or not to implement the model, which leads to phase six, which is deployment. So once we've got a model that is doing a decent job, then we go ahead and deploy it. We officially adopt it. And analysts in that phase should continue to monitor and document the model's performance, and investigate any radical changes in the model's fitness. So that's question one. Question two says, explain what needs to be done before you can forecast time series. In other words, what does time series analysis involve? So time series analysis is all about figuring out how a variable changes with time. To forecast with time series would involve making a model based on historical data and extending it outward to predict future values. So depending on the model that you choose, there may be certain calculations that need to be performed in preparation for the forecasting step. For example, we may choose to use moving averages in forecasting. That's a very common thing that's done. That would require us to find the average value of the variable over multiple periods of the same length. Okay, for example, a 5-day moving average would show for any given day the average value of the 5 days prior to that day. So that would be one example of some work that would need to be done before we can do any forecasting with the time series data that we've got. So and there are other examples, but so whether a moving average is used or some other type of any other type of analysis is used, there's almost always going to be some work to be done to get the data ready for forecasting. Question 3 says, discuss the main principles of data ethics as well as what companies or organizations could do to uphold these principles. Questions of data ethics tend to revolve around privacy, transparency, accountability, and equality. In regard to privacy, organizations need to comply with data privacy laws, which exist to ensure that individuals are in control of their personal data. Organizations need to get the consent of an individual before they collect and share private information. Data collection and sharing should also be transparent. So organizations need to communicate with their customers a clear overview. They need to give their customers a clear overview of the data that they collect and share. And once they've been given that consent, then organizations are responsible for that data. So they need to do their best to keep it secure. And when a breach occurs, they need to be held accountable. And finally, organizations must ensure that all groups are treated with equality. That is, that they're not discriminating against individuals or groups when handling and processing data. So, as I said, these data privacy laws, they exist to ensure that individuals are in control of their personal data, and it's a company's or organization's responsibility to stay in compliance with these laws. To do this, one thing that they do is they establish and adhere to sound data security measures to make sure that only authorized individuals have access to data. Question 4 says, imagine you're an analyst at a financial services company and you have some concerns about bias in the way a predictive model was measured. How would you raise your concerns with your manager? Make some suggestions for how to avoid measurement bias in the future. So I would communicate my concerns to my manager probably via email. And if I'm not getting, response to the email, then I might schedule, an appointment to go see my manager in person. But in this communication, I would try to be brief and clear about the precise nature of the concern. I'd try to phrase the concern in a non-threatening manner, such as, something like, hey, I'm concerned about whatever the concern is. Is it possible that maybe we overlooked something when we were coming up with the measurement plan, right? Something like that. Of course, these situations can be tricky, and it's possible that I'm wrong or that my manager knows something that I don't. So I think it's important to not let my ego get in the way and to insist that there's a problem here. That said, if I feel that the concern is not being given appropriate weight, if it's not being addressed adequately, then I might try to come back with some more forceful arguments and maybe even try to collect some evidence to show why I have the concern that I do. To help avoid measurement bias in the future, I would suggest a couple things. First of all, having multiple measuring devices so that we can more easily detect if something is malfunctioning in the measurement equipment. And number 2, I would suggest that the company ensure that the validators have adequate experience and training. Question 5 says, explain the difference between regression and classification models in predictive analysis. When would you use one of these models over the other? So regression models measure the relationship between quantitative variables, so like height versus shoe size, or amount spent at a grocery store versus personal income. Classification models, on the other hand, are more about predicting what category an entity will fall into. So, for example, a classification model would be used to determine if an email should be flagged as spam or not. Or it could be, if a customer is likely to purchase this particular item, and it doesn't have to be binary necessarily. It could be how likely is the customer to purchase this item and sort of split them into 3 or 4 categories. So anyway, if the goal of the model is to return a predicted numerical value when another numerical value is fed into the model, then a regression model is appropriate. But if the goal of the model is simply to categorize entities into groups, then a classification model would be the way to go. So those are the answers to those questions that I have put together. Thank you for listening, Mohit. Thank you for all of your help as usual, and I will talk to you later.